This is a new disease and none of us has immunity to it, and we're entering a delay phase. It's important to recognise that the contain phase of case identification and isolation has had an effect to delay things up until now. This is the shape of an epidemic. So you go along the bottom for some time with not very much happening, and that's probably where we are now. We're still on the flat part. As these curves start to take off, as more people get it, they take off quite steeply. And that's why timing is so important. Because what you want to do is to protect people during the most infectious period, and I'll explain that in just a minute. So we're in a period now where we've got some, but it hasn't yet taken off. The actions that we need to take are to try to do two things: delay the peak, and to push the peak down. So we're trying to reduce the number of cases at any one time. That's very important for NHS, in order to make the NHS able to cope with this. And it's also important because it pushes it out into summer months, where the NHS is less busy, but also where there may be less transmission of virus. Respiratory infections in general tend to be a bit less common. So that's one aim, is to change the shape of this. And it's important to recognise it's not to stop everybody getting it. You can't do that. It's not possible to stop everybody getting it. And it's also actually not desirable, because you want some immunity in the population. We need to have immunity to protect ourselves from this in the future. The second big aim that we need to look for is how, in that, we protect the vulnerable and the elderly, who are at most risk of serious illness and dying from this. And the way this disease looks as though it appears is that you have 5 days or so of mild viral illness, and then a small proportion of people get a second phase where they have some sort of immune response to it, which causes the damage. And the elderly and the sick are much more likely to get that. So during the period of peak transmission, we need to protect them at that phase. And if you look at the curves, it becomes obvious that if you do that at the moment, you're not protecting anybody, really, because the number of cases are too small. If you do it at the right time, then you're protecting them over the peak, and you're not asking them to be in isolation for too long. Similarly, with the idea of households going into complete isolation, that comes a bit later, when you've got some more cases coming up. At the moment, if you asked households to completely isolate if one person was ill, most people would not have coronavirus. You may have to do the whole thing all over again. And what happens then is the effect of that wanes, because people get fed up with doing this and you end up with not being able to do it time and time again. So the timing is critical, and that's true across all of the interventions we've looked at. That's why this is a package of things that need to happen at the right time and in the right phasing. In terms of mass gatherings and schools, it's true that there's some effect in closing schools, but that effect is minimal, and actually you'd have to do it for 13 to 16 weeks or longer, and you don't need to be a very advanced mathematician to work out that the chances of keeping children not speaking to each other or playing with each other over 13 to 16 weeks is 0. And therefore you have to be very careful to make sure you take the right measures that will stop this, rather than things which might end up with children, for example, going to stay with grandparents at a time when they might be most vulnerable. So the idea is to do things at the right time, not to end up with measures stopping during the peak and exposing more people to illness.